The modern seeker stands at the threshold of a paradox. In an age saturated with information, drowning in digital mysticism and commodified spirituality, the authentic path of transformation remains obscured beneath layers of distortion and trivialization. The question that inaugurates genuine esoteric work is not, "How can I gain power?" or "What secrets will elevate me above others?" but rather, "How does one undergo a fundamental restructuring of consciousness itself?" This is the question that spiritual alchemy addresses with unflinching rigor. Spiritual alchemy, distinct from its metallurgical predecessor yet intimately connected to it, represents one of humanity's most sophisticated maps of psychological and ontological transformation. Its roots extend deep into the Hellenistic mystery traditions, drawing sustenance from Egyptian metallurgy, Greek philosophy, and Gnostic cosmology. The legendary Hermes Trismegistus, that syncretic fusion of the Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth, stands as the mythological architect of this tradition. The Emerald Tablet, attributed to this thrice great sage, encodes the fundamental axiom, "As above, so below, as within, so without." This principle establishes the Hermetic universe as a vast network of correspondences, where the transformation of base metal into gold serves as both literal procedure and profound metaphor for the transformation of the unrealized human into the actualized adept. The tradition evolved through centuries of practice and refinement. Medieval alchemists like Paracelsus understood that the laboratory was simultaneously an outer workspace and an inner theater of consciousness. The retort and the alembic were tools of both chemical experimentation and psychological operation. By the 20th century, Carl Jung recognized in alchemical symbolism a complete map of what he termed individuation, the process by which the fragmented psyche achieves integration and wholeness. Jung's insight was revolutionary. The alchemists were not merely failed chemists stumbling toward the periodic table, but sophisticated depth psychologists working with the raw materials of the unconscious mind. The French occultist Eliphas Lévy understood this clearly when he wrote that magic, and by extension alchemy, is the science of the will. The great work, the Magnum Opus of transformation, demands not passive reception of grace or accidental enlightenment, but deliberate, sustained, and often agonizing effort. This is the first threshold that separates authentic esotericism from its contemporary simulacra. The recognition that transformation is work, not merely revelation. It requires the complete engagement of intellect, emotion, will, and body. The alchemical laboratory becomes a crucible in which the operator and the operated upon are ultimately one. What follows is neither a promise of easy transcendence nor a catalogue of mystical experiences to be collected like merit badges. It is a philosophical and psychological examination of the seven-stage process by which consciousness undergoes fundamental metamorphosis. This process has been encoded in various systems, the three principles of salt-sulfur and mercury. The sequence of color changes from black to white to red. The seven planetary operations, but beneath these symbolic variations lies a coherent structure of transformation that remains consistent across traditions and centuries. The Hermetic school approaches this material with the seriousness it demands, as a rigorous discipline requiring years of dedication, not a weekend workshop in manifestation. To comprehend spiritual alchemy as a system, one must first grasp its fundamental architecture, a sevenfold process of dissolution, purification, and reconstitution that operates simultaneously on multiple levels of being. These seven stages, calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation, form not merely a linear sequence, but a spiraling mandala of transformation. Each stage addresses a specific dimension of the psyche's bondage to unconscious patterns, inherited traumas, and egoic fixations. The number 7 itself bears profound significance within Hermetic philosophy. 7 classical planets governed the ancient cosmos, each representing not only celestial bodies, but psychological qualities and archetypal forces. 7 days comprise the week. 7 liberal arts formed the medieval curriculum. 7 chakras map the energy body in Eastern systems. This recurrence of the heptad across cultures suggests something fundamental about human consciousness and its developmental structure. The alchemists did not arbitrarily select 7 stages. They recognized in this number a natural rhythm of transformation inherent to the psyche's journey toward wholeness. Central to understanding this process are the 3 philosophical principles that underpin all alchemical operation: salt, sulfur, and mercury. These are not the common substances known by these names, but rather archetypal qualities. Salt represents the body, the physical vessel, the crystallized and fixed aspect of being, that which gives form and stability. Sulfur signifies the soul, the realm of desire and passion, the animating fire that drives transformation. Mercury embodies the spirit, the volatile principle of consciousness itself, the quicksilver intelligence that mediates between body and soul. Every stage of the alchemical work involves a specific relationship between these 3 principles, a particular reconfiguration of their interaction. The parallels with other esoteric systems become immediately apparent to the student versed in multiple traditions. The Kabbalistic tree of life presents a similar structure of transformation through its 10 Sephiroth and 4 worlds. The aspirant ascends from Malkuth, the material kingdom, through progressive stages of purification and illumination toward Kether, the crown of divine consciousness. The 3 pillars of the tree, severity, mercy, and equilibrium, correspond precisely to salt, sulfur, and mercury. Neoplatonism, that great philosophical bridge between pagan mystery religions and medieval Christian esotericism, describes the soul's descent into matter and subsequent ascent through the celestial spheres, shedding material accretions at each level. The Rosicrucian tradition, which emerged in 17th century Europe claiming ancient provenance, synthesized alchemical, Kabbalistic, and Christian mystical elements into a unified system of spiritual development. What unites these traditions is the recognition of a fundamental problem. Human consciousness in its ordinary state exists in a condition of fragmentation, ignorance, and bondage to unconscious forces. The ego, that sense of a unified self, is revealed through esoteric practice to be a provisional construction, a necessary but ultimately illusory organizing principle. Beneath the ego's thin veneer lie vast territories of shadow material, repressed desires, unprocessed traumas, disowned qualities projected onto others. Jung termed this the personal unconscious, but beneath it lies something deeper still, the collective unconscious, that repository of archetypal patterns and primordial images shared by all humanity. The mentality required of the authentic adept differs radically from both conventional religiosity and scientific materialism. Religious faith often demands belief without understanding, submission without questioning. Scientific materialism insists on external verification and dismisses inner experience as epiphenomenal or illusory. The esoteric path requires something more paradoxical, rigorous skepticism combined with experiential openness. The adept must cultivate what Aleister Crowley called the magical will, not mere willfulness or desire, but a laser-focused intentionality that aligns all aspects of the psyche toward a singular aim. This will is not the will to power in Nietzsche's sense, but the will to transformation, the relentless commitment to self-knowing that refuses all consolations and self-deceptions. Equally crucial is what might be termed occult ethics, a moral framework distinct from conventional morality. Conventional morality often operates through external rules, social conformity, and the avoidance of punishment or social censure. Occult ethics emerges from self-knowledge and the recognition of interconnection. The adept who has confronted their own shadow, who has seen clearly the violence, cruelty, and selfishness that exists within, cannot easily project these qualities onto others. The integration of the shadow paradoxically produces genuine compassion, not the sentimental variety, but compassion grounded in the recognition of shared human frailty and darkness. This ethical stance acknowledges that every act of consciousness has consequences that ripple through the web of existence. Finally, the adept must cultivate a disposition toward methodological doubt, not the paralyzing skepticism that prevents action, but a healthy wariness of both external authority and internal certainty. The spiritual marketplace overflows with teachers promising rapid enlightenment, systems guaranteeing results, and techniques offering shortcuts to transcendence. The Hermetic tradition counsels caution. Verify through personal experience. Test the spirits as the biblical injunction advises. Recognize that the path of transformation is not a steady ascent, but a spiral journey, including periods of regression, confusion, and apparent failure. The great work cannot be rushed. Those who claim otherwise are either self-deceived or deliberately deceptive. The alchemical journey begins with fire. Calcination, associated with the element of fire, and the planet Saturn, represents the initial breakdown of ego structures through the application of intense heat. Metaphorically, the heat of self-examination, crisis, or suffering that exposes the inadequacy of one's current mode of being. In the physical laboratory, calcination reduces material to ash, burning away impurities and leaving only the essential mineral salts. Psychologically, this corresponds to the collapse of the persona, that carefully constructed social mask we present to the world. Jung recognized calcination in the phenomenon of ego inflation, followed by its puncture. The individual who has built their identity on external achievements, career success, physical beauty, intellectual prowess, inevitably encounters circumstances that reveal the fragility of these supports. Illness, failure, loss, betrayal. These experiences serve as the calcinating fire that reduces the inflated ego to its fundamental components. This is not mere suffering, but productive suffering, suffering that serves a teleological purpose in the economy of transformation. The calcinating process often manifests through what the Christian mystics called acedia, or spiritual dryness, a profound sense of meaninglessness where previous sources of satisfaction lose their savor. The ambitious career no longer motivates. The relationship that once provided identity now feels constraining. The beliefs that structured one's worldview suddenly appear hollow. This is the first intimation of the void, the recognition that the egoic structure one has labored to construct rests on nothing substantial. From a phenomenological perspective, calcination represents the breakdown of intentional structures through which consciousness organizes experience. The ready-to-hand becomes present at hand. To use Heidegger's terminology, the transparent become opaque. Actions previously performed automatically now require conscious deliberation, revealing their constructed nature. This defamiliarization of the familiar creates profound anxiety, but also opens the possibility of reconstructing consciousness on more authentic foundations. The danger inherent in calcination is twofold. First, one may resist the process entirely, doubling down on ego defenses, becoming more rigid and brittle in an effort to maintain the status quo. This resistance only intensifies the eventual collapse when it comes. Second, one may identify with the destruction itself, becoming trapped in a cycle of self-sabotage and nihilistic negation. The authentic alchemist recognizes calcination not as an end but as a beginning, the necessary clearing of ground before new construction can commence. Following the fire of calcination comes the water of dissolution. Associated with the element of water and the planet Jupiter, dissolution represents the liquefaction of the calcinated material, the washing away of rigid boundaries, the submersion into the unconscious. Where calcination employs active destruction, dissolution involves passive surrender to forces greater than the ego's control. Psychologically, dissolution manifests as the flooding of consciousness by previously repressed material. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions long suppressed surge into awareness. Memories thought forgotten surface with startling clarity. The neat categories through which one organized experience begin to blur and intermingle. The solid boundaries of the ego become permeable, and one experiences disturbing episodes of merger with others, confusion about where one ends and another begins. Jung associated dissolution with the encounter with the anima or animus, those contrasexual soul figures that mediate between ego and unconscious. For the male practitioner, the anima appears as mysterious woman in dreams and fantasies, luring consciousness into the depths. For the female practitioner, the animus manifests as multiple male figures representing different qualities of assertiveness and logos consciousness. These figures are not to be taken literally, but recognized as personifications of psychic content that demands integration. The dissolution stage often coincides with powerful emotional catharsis, the weeping, rage, and grief that emerge when emotional defenses dissolve. Therapeutic modalities like psychoanalysis and somatic experiencing work within this domain, creating safe containers for the dissolution of traumatic material held in psychosomatic tension. The body itself holds memory and pain that must be dissolved through awareness and emotional expression. From a spiritual perspective, dissolution represents the baptismal immersion, the descent into the waters of chaos that precede new creation. Every cosmogony begins with primordial waters, the Egyptian Nun, the Babylonian Tiamat, the Genesis Tehom. These waters represent the undifferentiated potential from which all forms emerge. To dissolve in these waters is to return temporarily to the state before individuation, before the crystallization of separate identity. This can be terrifying as it threatens annihilation, but it is also liberating, offering release from the prison of rigid selfhood. The practitioner navigating dissolution must develop what might be called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without reaching after fact and reason, as Keats described it. This is not intellectual confusion, but a deliberate tolerance for ambiguity, a willingness to not know that opens space for new patterns to emerge from chaos. Too much structure at this stage impedes the process, too little risks fragmentation. The art lies in maintaining just enough witnessing consciousness to observe the dissolution without becoming lost in it. After the ego has been calcinated to ash and dissolved in the waters of the unconscious, the stage of separation employs the air element and the discriminating intellect to sort through the material, distinguishing the valuable from the worthless, the true self from the false. Associated with the planet Mars and the element of air, separation is the sword that cuts, the judgment that discriminates. Psychologically, separation involves the difficult work of discernment. As unconscious material floods awareness during dissolution, not all of it serves the process of integration. Some contents represent genuine aspects of the self that have been disowned and must be reclaimed. Others are truly toxic patterns absorbed from family systems, cultural conditioning, or traumatic experiences that must be recognized and rejected. The challenge lies in distinguishing between them. This is the stage where shadow work becomes most explicit and demanding. Jung defined the shadow as the repository of qualities we deny in ourselves and project onto others. But the shadow is not uniformly negative. It contains gold as well as dross, creative potential as well as destructive impulses. The perfectionist whose shadow contains rage at their own imperfection must learn to separate legitimate anger at injustice from the self-destructive fury of the wounded child. The compliant people-pleaser whose shadow contains authentic assertion must distinguish healthy boundary setting from the narcissistic demands of inflation. Separation requires brutal honesty, the willingness to see oneself without the flattering distortions of ego protection. It demands that we examine our motivations with forensic precision. Why do I engage in this behavior? What psychological need does it fulfill? Is this response emerging from my authentic center or from traumatic conditioning? These questions cannot be answered superficially. They require sustained attention and the courage to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. In alchemical imagery, separation is often depicted as a dismemberment, the cutting apart of the alchemical marriage partners, the division of the rebis or hermaphrodite into its constituent male and female principles. This mirrors the psychological process of differentiating the various complexes and sub-personalities that constitute the psyche. We are not unitary beings, but multiplicities, containing various voices and impulses that often conflict. Separation makes these distinct voices audible so that they can eventually be harmonized rather than remaining in unconscious warfare. The danger of separation lies in becoming trapped in analysis, endlessly dissecting oneself without moving toward synthesis. Some individuals spend decades in therapy analyzing their patterns without ever integrating the insights into transformed behavior. Separation must eventually give way to conjunction, but premature synthesis will be superficial, papering over conflicts that have not been adequately differentiated. The timing of this transition cannot be predetermined, but must be intuited through self-observation. Having separated the valuable from the worthless, the purified elements must be recombined in a new configuration. Conjunction, associated with the planet Venus and the element of water in its nurturing rather than dissolving mode, represents the hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, the union of opposites that generates new life. In classical alchemical imagery, conjunction is depicted as the marriage of the Red King and the White Queen, the union of sun and moon, the joining of male and female principles. This is not merely a sexual metaphor, but represents the integration of all manner of opposites that have been separated: consciousness and unconscious, logos and eros, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, active and passive. Jung recognized conjunction as the core of the individuation process, the creation of a new unity that transcends and includes the opposites rather than remaining unconsciously identified with one pole and projecting its opposite. Psychologically, conjunction often manifests through the integration of anima and animus. The man who has become conscious of his anima no longer projects her onto women, seeking completion through relationship. Instead, he develops his own relatedness, emotional depth, and receptivity. The woman who has integrated her animus no longer requires a man to provide assertiveness and direction, but accesses these qualities directly. This does not eliminate the possibility or desirability of relationship. Rather, it transforms relationship from a desperate search for completion into a meeting of two whole beings. Conjunction also involves the integration of the shadow. Those qualities that were identified, separated, and examined in the previous stage must now be consciously incorporated into the personality. This is not simply expressing repressed impulses in an unconstrained way, but finding appropriate and constructive channels for energies that were previously either repressed or expressed destructively. The individual who has repressed anger learns to access righteous indignation in service of justice. The person who has denied their vulnerability learns to acknowledge weakness without being overwhelmed by it. From a spiritual perspective, conjunction represents the creation of the subtle body, what esoteric traditions call the diamond body, the resurrection body, or the body of light. This is not a physical entity, but a new organization of consciousness that transcends the body-mind duality. In Taoist alchemy, this is the creation of the immortal fetus, the crystallization of spirit that survives the death of the physical form. Whether one takes this literally or metaphorically, it points to a fundamental shift in the locus of identity from the temporal ego to something more permanent and essential. The challenge of conjunction is maintaining the tension of opposites without collapsing back into one-sidedness. It is tempting to resolve the discomfort of holding contradictions by reverting to familiar patterns. The religious convert who once rigidly identified with atheistic materialism now rigidly identifies with dogmatic faith, having merely inverted the polarity without achieving genuine integration. True conjunction involves a third position that transcends both poles. Not a compromise that dilutes both, but a synthesis that includes and transforms both. After the conjunction has created a new unity, this newly formed compound must undergo fermentation, a process of decomposition that paradoxically generates new life. Associated with the moon and the element of water in its putrefying aspect, fermentation represents death and rebirth, the necessary rotting of the old form to release the energies that will animate the new. In physical alchemy, fermentation involves the bacterial or yeast-driven breakdown of organic matter, producing alcohol or other substances through controlled decay. The fermentation of grape juice yields wine. The fermentation of grain produces beer. The fermentation of wheat creates bread. In each case, apparent corruption generates something of greater value and complexity. Psychologically, fermentation corresponds to what Christian mystics called the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation, meaninglessness, and abandonment that paradoxically represents the deepest stage of transformation. Jung associated fermentation with what he termed the transcendent function, the psychological capacity to hold tension between opposites until a third, previously unimaginable possibility emerges. This is not synthesis achieved through intellectual effort, but an organic development that arises spontaneously when consciousness maintains the tension without flight or premature resolution. The transcendent function often manifests through powerful dreams, synchronicities, or creative insights that could not have been predicted from prior content. Fermentation is characterized by a peculiar quality of suffering distinct from earlier stages. Where calcination involved the pain of ego deflation and dissolution, brought the chaos of overwhelmed fermentation involves a more subtle anguish. The feeling that the entire spiritual journey has been futile, that no genuine transformation has occurred, that one is fundamentally unchanged despite all efforts. This is the false despair that precedes authentic rebirth, the darkness before the dawn that many abandon the path, never recognizing that they stood at the very threshold of breakthrough. The spiritual literature abounds with testimonies to this stage. St. John of the Cross described the dark night as a period when all previous consolations cease, when God seems absent, when prayer becomes dust and ashes in the mouth. The Buddha, after years of ascetic practice, recognized the futility of his efforts and sat beneath the Bodhi tree in what might be termed sacred despair. Mother Teresa's private writings reveal decades of feeling abandoned by the divine presence she served. These are not failures of faith, but necessary stages in the transformation process. The danger of fermentation is first the risk of suicide, either literal or psychic. The despair can become so overwhelming that the individual sees no possibility of emergence and terminates the journey. Second, there is the risk of what might be termed spiritual materialism, attempting to escape the discomfort through intensified practice, seeking new teachers or techniques, anything to avoid the confrontation with the void. The authentic practitioner must learn to do nothing, to wait in the darkness without seeking rescue, trusting a process whose outcome cannot be guaranteed. Following the decomposition of fermentation, distillation employs heat to vaporize and then condense the essential components, purifying them through repeated cycles of vaporization and condensation. Associated with the planet Mercury and the element of air, distillation represents the extraction of quintessence, the fifth element beyond earth, water, fire, and air, the spiritual essence of consciousness itself. In practical alchemy, distillation uses the alembic, a vessel consisting of a cucurbit, heated vessel, an alembic cap, collection point for vapor, and a receiver, collection vessel for condensed liquid. The material is heated until it vaporizes, rises into the cap, cools and condenses, then drips into the receiver. This process may be repeated multiple times, each cycle increasing purity. Psychologically, distillation corresponds to the process of meta-awareness, the capacity to observe one's consciousness from an increasingly refined and detached perspective. This is the stage where meditation practice, particularly insight meditation, becomes most effective. The practitioner learns to observe thoughts, emotions, and sensations with equanimity, neither grasping at pleasant experiences nor rejecting unpleasant ones. Through repeated observation, one recognizes the impermanent nature of all mental phenomena. Thoughts arise and pass, emotions swell and subside, sensations emerge and dissolve. What remains constant is the witnessing awareness itself, the pure consciousness that observes but is not identical with its contents. Jung associated distillation with the emergence of the self, that transpersonal center, and circumference of the psyche that transcends yet includes the ego. The self is not created through the alchemical process, but revealed, uncovered through the removal of obscurations. It is simultaneously the goal of the journey and that which has been present throughout, directing the process from behind the scenes. Mystical traditions describe this as the discovery that the seeker and the sought are ultimately identical. The Atman is Brahman, the individual soul is the universal consciousness. Distillation involves a particular quality of asceticism. Not the life-denying asceticism of mortification, but the discrimination between the essential and the accidental, the willingness to release attachments that obstruct clarity. This might involve literal simplification of life, reducing possessions, commitments, and entanglements, but more fundamentally, it involves the letting go of psychological attachments, the need to be right, the clinging to particular identities and roles, the addictions to familiar emotional patterns, even when they cause suffering. The challenge of distillation is avoiding what might be termed spiritual bypassing, using detachment as a defense against genuine feeling, employing equanimity as an excuse for emotional withdrawal, mistaking dissociation for transcendence. Authentic distillation does not negate the previous stages, but refines their products. The shadow integration of conjunction is not abandoned, but viewed from a more spacious perspective. The emotions accessed in dissolution are not suppressed but observed with less identification. The practitioner achieves what Buddhists call the middle way, neither grasping nor rejecting, neither indulgence nor suppression. The final stage, coagulation, brings the process full circle. Associated with the planet Saturn and the element of earth, coagulation represents the materialization of the spiritual essence. Distilled in the previous stage, the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, that legendary substance said to transmute base metals into gold and grant immortality. Psychologically, coagulation corresponds to the incarnation of realized consciousness in concrete life, the translation of insight into action, wisdom into ethics. In physical alchemy, coagulation involves the solidification of the purified essence into a stable, incorruptible form. The volatile becomes fixed, the spiritual becomes material without losing its essence. This is not a regression to the calcinated ego of stage 1, but the creation of what might be termed the transpersonal ego, an ego structure that serves rather than obstructs the self, a personality that functions as a vehicle for consciousness rather than an obstacle to it. Jung described the goal of individuation not as ego dissolution, but as the right relationship between ego and self. The individuated person does not become egoless, but develops an ego that acknowledges its proper place within the larger psyche. Such an individual can engage fully in the world, maintaining relationships, pursuing work, navigating practical challenges, while remaining rooted in the transpersonal awareness accessed through distillation. This is the meaning of being in the world, but not of it. Coagulation manifests as the capacity for what Buddhists call skillful action, behavior that emerges spontaneously from wisdom and compassion rather than from conditioning and reactivity. The individuated person acts with awareness of consequences, with consideration for others, with alignment between values and behavior. This is not the rigid morality of conventional ethics, but an organic righteousness that flows from self-knowledge. From a spiritual perspective, coagulation represents what Hindu tradition calls jivan mukta, liberation while living, the achievement of enlightenment without abandoning bodily existence. The realized being no longer seeks escape from the world, but recognizes the world as the very substance of the divine, matter as frozen light, the body as the temple of consciousness. This is the ultimate reversal of the dualistic split between spirit and matter that initiated the quest. The coagulated consciousness possesses what alchemists called the medicine of metals, the capacity to catalyze transformation in others. Just as the Philosopher's Stone transmutes lead into gold through its mere presence, the individuated being accelerates the development of those they encounter, not through preaching or teaching, but through embodiment. Their presence creates a field that invites others toward wholeness. This is the true meaning of the guru or spiritual teacher, not one who possesses secret knowledge to dispense, but one whose realized state of consciousness becomes contagious. Among the 7 stages, fermentation represents the most perilous passage, the authentic dark night that separates those who complete the great work from those who abandon the path. This stage deserves extended consideration, for it is here that the transformation becomes genuinely alchemical rather than merely psychological, where the journey from self-improvement becomes transmutation. The crisis precipitated by fermentation differs essentially from common depression or existential malaise. Clinical depression often involves a collapse into hopelessness that seeks relief through medication, therapy, or circumstantial change. The fermentation crisis, by contrast, arrives precisely when the practitioner has made genuine progress, has achieved significant insight, and has established a degree of integration. It comes not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a necessary stage that must be endured. St. John of the Cross, in his systematic analysis of the dark night, distinguished between the dark night of the senses and the dark night of the spirit. The former involves the loss of consolation derived from spiritual practices. Meditation no longer brings peace. Prayer feels hollow, rituals seem empty. The latter penetrates deeper, calling into question not merely the efficacy of practices, but the entire meaning and purpose of existence itself. The individual feels abandoned not only by God or the transcendent, but by their own deepest nature, as if the self has withdrawn, leaving the ego to confront absolute nothingness. This confrontation with the void distinguishes esoteric crisis from psychopathology. Modern psychiatry tends to pathologize all experiences of meaninglessness, treating them as symptoms to be eliminated through pharmaceutical or cognitive intervention. From the Hermetic perspective, certain experiences of meaninglessness serve a necessary function in development. The ego's meaning-making structures must be dismantled to create space for a more authentic relationship with being. What appears as depression may actually be the death throes of false identity, the anguish of transformation mistaken for illness. Phenomenologically, the fermentation crisis involves the collapse of intentionality itself, the fundamental structure through which consciousness relates to the world. Heidegger's analysis of anxiety in being and time illuminates this experience. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, anxiety has no determinate object. One is anxious about nothing in particular, which reveals the nothing as such, the groundlessness of existence that is normally concealed by our absorption in daily concerns and projects. This encounter with the nothing is terrifying because it reveals the contingency of all meanings and values we have constructed. The alchemical texts encode this crisis in imagery of putrefaction, the blackening or nigredo that follows the conjunction. The royal couple, having united in sacred marriage, now lie dead in a coffin, their union producing not life but decay. This is not failure but necessity. The old forms must completely die for the new to emerge. The Western spiritual traditions emphasize this through the motif of resurrection. Christ must die before rising. The grain of wheat must fall into the earth and die before bearing fruit. Eastern traditions describe it as the great death that precedes enlightenment, the total cessation of egoic functioning that reveals the deathless. What distinguishes this crisis from nihilistic despair is its teleological character. It serves a purpose within the larger economy of transformation. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, distinguished between suffering that has meaning and suffering that is merely senseless. The fermentation crisis, while involving genuine suffering, possesses inherent meaning as part of the developmental process. The practitioner need not impose meaning upon it through interpretation. The meaning is intrinsic to its function within the alchemical sequence. The practical challenge involves maintaining consciousness through this stage without either collapsing into identification with the despair or prematurely seeking escape through spiritual bypassing. The practitioner must learn what might be termed hopeless hope, continuing the work without expectation of success, maintaining discipline without belief in its efficacy, persisting in the face of apparent futility. This is the final test of will, the demonstration that one's commitment to transformation does not depend on positive feedback or visible progress. Those who navigate this passage successfully report a peculiar reversal at its nadir. At the point of deepest despair, when all seems lost and the journey appears to have been delusion, something shifts. The fermentation process completes itself, and the putrefaction that seemed like death reveals itself as gestation. What was rotting was the old identity, making space for something genuinely new. The consciousness that emerges on the far side of this passage possesses a quality of authenticity and depth that could not have been achieved through any other means. This is why the Hermetic tradition insists that transformation cannot be rushed, why the various stages cannot be skipped or artificially accelerated. Each stage creates conditions necessary for the next, and the fermentation crisis in particular cannot be circumvented without aborting the entire process. Those who seek shortcuts, who employ techniques promising rapid enlightenment without this passage through darkness, achieve at best a facsimile of transformation, a restructured ego that has not undergone genuine death and rebirth. The completion of the 7 stages produces what alchemists called the Philosopher's Stone, Jung termed the individuated self, and various mystical traditions have named enlightenment, gnosis, or liberation. Crucially, this end state is not a fixed achievement, but a new mode of being in the world, a transformed relationship to consciousness itself that continues to deepen through the remainder of life. The individuated consciousness possesses several distinguishing characteristics. First, there is a quality of psychological integration, where previously fragmented aspects of the psyche function coherently. The shadow has been acknowledged and assimilated, depriving it of its power to sabotage conscious intentions through unconscious sabotage. The anima or animus has been integrated, eliminating the compulsive quality of projection that characterizes immature relationships. The persona has been right-sized, neither rigidly maintained as identical with the self nor rejected as inauthentic, but recognized as a functional tool for navigating social reality. Second, the individuated person demonstrates what might be called ethical automaticity, moral behavior that flows spontaneously from character rather than requiring conscious deliberation or rule-following. This is not antinomianism, the rejection of moral law, but its transcendence through embodiment. The realized being does not steal not because of fear of consequences or adherence to commandment, but because stealing is incompatible with their nature. They speak truth not from obligation, but from alignment with reality. This is the meaning of Taoist wu-wei, action through non-action, behavior that is effortless because it expresses rather than contradicts essential nature. Third, there emerges a capacity for genuine presence, the ability to encounter reality without the distorting filters of projection, expectation, and interpretation. Martin Buber's distinction between ayat and aidhu relationships illuminates this capacity. In ayat mode, one relates to the other as an object to be used, categorized, or manipulated. In aidhu mode, one encounters the other as a subject, a center of consciousness equally real and valuable as oneself. The individuated person increasingly dwells in I-thou consciousness, meeting each person, situation, and moment with fresh awareness, rather than through the deadening repetition of habitual patterns. Fourth, the completed alchemical work produces what traditions call the transpersonal perspective, the capacity to experience oneself as simultaneously wave and ocean, individual and universal, temporal and eternal. This is not a cognitive belief, but a lived reality, accessed through direct perception. The individuated consciousness recognizes its particular embodiment as a temporary localization of awareness that remains fundamentally inseparable from the totality of existence. Death loses its absolute terror because identity no longer resides exclusively in the biographical self that will indeed perish, but includes the transpersonal dimension that transcends temporal boundaries. The practical implications of this transformation manifest in every dimension of life. In relationships, the individuated person no longer seeks completion through another, but engages from wholeness, creating partnerships characterized by genuine freedom rather than unconscious dependency. They do not require others to fulfill projected needs or to carry disowned aspects of their psyche. This makes possible authentic intimacy, the capacity to be truly known and to truly know another, which can only occur between two whole beings. In work and creative endeavor, the transformed consciousness brings a quality of dedication without attachment to outcomes. The practitioner engages fully in their labor, bringing complete attention and effort, while remaining equanimous regarding success or failure. This is not indifference, but freedom from the tyranny of results. One creates because creation expresses their nature, not to achieve external validation or material reward. This paradoxically often produces work of higher quality, as the energy previously consumed by anxiety about outcomes becomes available for the work itself. In relation to suffering, one's own and that of others, the individuated consciousness develops genuine compassion distinct from sentimental pity or codependent rescuing. Having traversed the dark night of their own soul, having confronted the full measure of human capacity for darkness and self-deception, such a person can bear witness to others' suffering without either being overwhelmed by it or needing to fix it. They recognize that certain suffering serves developmental purposes and that premature rescue may actually obstruct necessary growth. This is the compassion of the skilled physician who performs necessary surgery despite causing temporary pain, understanding it serves ultimate healing. The individuated person also bears what might be termed ontological responsibility, the recognition that consciousness itself has ethical weight, that one's inner state affects the field of collective consciousness. This is not magical thinking, but acknowledgement of the subtle ways human beings influence one another through presence, mood, and energetic quality. The transformed individual understands they have a responsibility to maintain their own consciousness in a state of clarity and compassion, not for narcissistic self-perfection, but because consciousness is fundamentally shared, and what occurs within one node of the network affects all others. Yet, individuation does not produce superhuman perfection or permanent bliss. The individuated person still experiences pain, frustration, confusion, and error. They still possess an ego that can become temporarily inflated or defensive. The difference lies in the relationship to these phenomena. Where the pre-individuated person identifies with and is controlled by these states, the individuated consciousness maintains witnessing awareness even in the midst of reactivity. They recover more quickly from perturbation, repair relational ruptures more skillfully, and learn from mistakes more readily. This is why the Hermetic tradition, properly understood, resists the cult of the guru or enlightened master who has transcended all human limitation. Such figures are either frauds or self-deceived. The authentic adept acknowledges their continuing humanity while embodying a transformed relationship to that humanity. They model not perfection, but integration, not transcendence of the human condition, but its full embrace with awareness. The application of alchemical transformation to contemporary life requires particular discernment. The modern world presents unprecedented challenges: technological acceleration that outpaces psychological adaptation, ecological crisis that threatens civilizational collapse, information overload that fragments attention, and social atomization that undermines traditional sources of meaning and belonging. The individuated person does not withdraw into private enlightenment, but engages these challenges with the resources developed through inner work. This engagement, however, differs from conventional activism or social involvement. The transformed consciousness recognizes that external problems reflect and are perpetuated by collective psychological patterns, the shadow dynamics of groups and nations, the unconscious repetition of traumatic histories, the projections of disowned qualities onto scapegoated others. Genuine social change requires not merely altered policies or institutions, but the transformation of the consciousness that creates and sustains dysfunctional systems. The individuated person contributes to collective evolution by embodying an alternative possibility, by functioning as what Rupert Sheldrake calls a morphic resonance that makes similar transformations easier for others. The Hermetic school's emphasis on discipline and rigor serves this understanding. The contemporary spiritual marketplace offers numerous paths promising rapid results with minimal effort: weekend enlightenment experiences, plant medicine shortcuts, technological consciousness hacking through neurostimulation. While such approaches may produce temporary altered states or valuable insights, they cannot substitute for the sustained inner work that actually restructures character and consciousness. The alchemical path is slow, difficult, and requires years, if not decades, of dedicated practice. This is not an unfortunate limitation, but a necessary feature, as transformation of this depth cannot be rushed without becoming superficial. The distinction between genuine spiritual development and its simulacra becomes increasingly important as artificial intelligence and biotechnology offer new possibilities for consciousness alteration. One can imagine futures where neurological enhancement produces states resembling enlightenment, expanded awareness, reduced reactivity, increased compassion, without the developmental journey that traditionally produces these qualities. Would such technologically induced states constitute authentic transformation, or merely sophisticated mimicry? The Hermetic perspective suggests that consciousness achieved through inner work differs essentially from consciousness produced through external intervention, because the former involves the integration of the entire life history and personality structure, while the latter remains superimposed upon unchanged foundations. The map of transformation traced through these 7 stages reveals a fundamental paradox that must be grasped by anyone who would undertake the great work. The goal you seek is simultaneously the means of seeking it. The treasure you hunt is that which empowers the hunt, and the transformation you pursue is that which pursues you. The alchemists encoded this in their maxim: "The stone that is no stone, the stone that is everywhere rejected by the foolish, is the very matter of the work." What you are seeking through this arduous process of calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, and coagulation is not a substance to be acquired or a state to be achieved, but your own fundamental nature to be recognized. The ego that begins the journey believing it will gain enlightenment must eventually discover that enlightenment is not a possession but the relinquishment of the possessor. The consciousness that survives the dark night is not the ego that entered it, yet it is not something utterly foreign either. It is what you have always been beneath the accumulated layers of conditioning, trauma, and false identity. This is why the Hermetic path cannot be commodified or democratized, despite contemporary attempts to do so. It requires not merely information but transformation, not concepts but lived experience, not techniques but character. The Hermetic school maintains its standards precisely because lowering them would render the teaching ineffective. The difficulty is not arbitrary gatekeeping, but reflects the actual nature of the work. Just as one cannot become a master musician through casual dabbling or achieve athletic excellence through sporadic effort, one cannot complete the alchemical transformation without sustained dedication, intelligent practice, and willingness to undergo whatever suffering the process demands. The Hermetic tradition persists across millennia, not through institutional preservation, but through the perpetual rediscovery of these truths by successive generations of practitioners. Each age must clothe the perennial wisdom in contemporary language and symbol, must address the particular distortions and opportunities of its era, must navigate between the Scylla of rigid traditionalism and the Charybdis of trendy innovation. This present moment, with its unique combination of crisis and possibility, calls for practitioners who can embody ancient wisdom while engaging modern reality, who can maintain the integrity of the tradition while making it accessible to sincere seekers. The reward for this demanding journey is not power over others or escape from the human condition, but the achievement of one's own particular excellence, the actualization of the unique potential encoded in each individual life. You become most fully yourself precisely by transcending the small self, most deeply individual precisely by recognizing your continuity with the whole. This is the true gold that alchemy produces, not a material substance but a quality of consciousness, a mode of being, a way of meeting reality with clarity, courage, and compassion. The question that remains is not whether this path is too difficult, too demanding, too costly in time and suffering. The question is whether you possess the philosophical temperament, the spiritual hunger, and the existential courage to walk it. Many are called to the work, few complete it. Not because of artificial restriction or elite exclusivity, but because most abandon the journey when it demands more than they are willing to give. When the dark night arrives and comfort systems fail, when the price of transformation reveals itself as nothing less than everything you thought you were. The great work awaits those who would undertake it with eyes open, with realistic assessment of the difficulty, with commitment that survives disillusionment. For such practitioners, the Hermetic school offers not promises of easy enlightenment, but accurate maps of difficult terrain, not comforting certainties, but useful guidance through necessary confusion, not salvation through external agency, but the tools and knowledge to forge one's own consciousness into the vessel that can contain the gold of realized being. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that lights the fire.